Everybody, happy to have you all here today. Just as a quick introduction, I'm Ryan Quinn. I'm the academic director of the Project on Positive Leadership. My partner, Ramy, is the administrative director of the Project on Positive Leadership. And we, on behalf of the project, we are happy to welcome you all here to hear Ryan Gottfredson speak. A couple of announcements before we get started so that everybody's ready. The first one is that we have been informed that the library has sent down a vat of water in cups because it's hot in here, and if you need some water, you can grab some. It's right outside. So that's the first thing. Second thing is I'd just like to encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to go to LinkedIn and connect with the Project on Positive Leadership there. We have a community, and we often send out notifications about events like these, about people that are doing great things or that we want to honor in some way, about tools that we're releasing, research that's been done, other things that might be of interest to people who find these kinds of topics interesting. And so one of the things that you'll find that we'll have announcements coming out before too long is we have an event. We're calling it normally we have leadership tool showcases, but in April we're going to have a leadership tool extravaganza, because we'll have multiple of our virtues experts presenting on tools, and this one is all tools around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to engage in positive leadership around those topics. So we expect it will be exciting. There'll be a lot of great things going on. Those are the kind of things that get announced regularly on our LinkedIn community. Just a couple more announcements. Sorry we have so many. Their bookstore is going to be doing a book sale outside of this room after it's over. If you're interested in want to learn more about what you've heard about, if you're not already in one of the book clubs that we've already had and have met and discussed Ryan's book. And so in case it's extra incentive, they give 25% off for students, 15% off for faculty if you're interested in buying a book. And then Ryan will also be doing a book signing there afterwards. For those of you who are students and were offered extra credits, then please, Ramy, if you can wave there in the back. Ramy is the person you want to talk to make sure you claim that extra credit. And then the last announcement before I introduce Ryan is that if you're with the Employee Success Center Book Club and you haven't claimed your book already, also please talk to Ramy, who's there in the back. So, having now put you all to sleep with my announcements, let me do a quick introduction and bring up the person that you actually came here to see. I met Ryan probably about a decade ago now it's been, and just was instantly like, oh, this is a really good guy, and was excited to get to know him. At the back, probably not long after that, is when he first talked to me about writing a book. At the time I was a new author and he was starting as an author, and he has since gone on his first book, Success Mindsets. If you haven't looked him up already, is a Wall Street Journal bestseller and has done fabulously. And today he'll be talking to us about his second book, which is Vertical Leadership. And so he is from Cal State Fullerton, a professor there in the management department. I looked up on Rate My Professors to see all the wonderful things his students had to say about him, and was a very popular professor there for all the stuff that he does. He also has published in some of our best journals and has worked with many brand name companies around the world that you would recognize, and has lots of interesting stories to tell about his work there. And so we are very honored to have him here today. I'm going to pass the mic on and give him a chance to put it on instead of me. And thank you for coming. We're so glad you're here.
For sure. Thank you. Let me get mic'd up here for a second. We should be good. It really is an honor to be here, and it's even a greater honor that you showed up today. That you make me feel good, so thank you. As Ryan mentioned, I'm Ryan Gottfredson. I'm a leadership professor at Cal State Fullerton. Anybody heard of Cal State Fullerton? I hadn't when I applied to Cal State Fullerton, so I did my PhD up the road at Indiana University. Come job search time, and I'm sending applications out. And I only sent an application to Cal State Fullerton because it was the closest place where my wife's dad lived. I had never heard about Cal State Fullerton. I show up in my first job interview, and they ask you the question, well, what do you know about Cal State Fullerton? And I gave the worst answer possible, and I said, I don't know anything. And I went on to somehow get a job there, so which has been great. I've gone on to, as Ryan mentioned, write a couple of books, and I'm kind of curious, who here has read my latest book, The Elevated Leader? Okay, Great. All right. For those who've read it, what we'll talk about today might be a little bit repetitive, but you'll get it from the horse's mouth, I guess. And then I'm fortunate to work with organizations all over the world to help them develop their leaders. And that really gets us into our purpose here today. Really, the purpose that I have for our time is to present to you some novel ideas and insights about how you can become a better leader, a more positive influence within your spheres of responsibility, and how you can help others do the same. So I believe that the ideas that we're going to cover today are, for many of you, are probably ideas that you've never heard of before. But I personally have found them groundbreaking for my own personal development and in the development that I'm fortunate to do with leaders. So let me give you a little outline of what we're going to do here. So this really isn't about me, but I do want to tell you a little bit about where these ideas come from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my past. Most of our time, we're going to talk about the book, the content in the book, and apply it again to you and how you can elevate yourself as well as the leaders around you. And then I want to share with you some of since I wrote the book, some of my latest learnings. That I think that you'll find really interesting, and that'll cap us off at I think a really cool takeaway. As we go along, I mean, we're a fairly small group. I'm a pretty informal person. At any time, if you have any comments, questions, don't hesitate to raise your hand. There's going to be surely a couple points where I'm going to say, all right, does this make sense? Any questions? And we'll have a little bit of conversation. We'll save some time at the end for some question and answers. So, does that sound good? All right. So let me tell you about a light bulb moment that I had when I was at Indiana University. So I did my dissertation on leadership. And this provided an awesome opportunity to review the last 70 years of leadership research. And my light bulb moment came kind of at the end of this. I'm defending my dissertation, and it just kind of hits me that, wow, the last 70 years of leadership research primarily focuses on asking and answering one primary question. Of course, there's more questions, but one primary question. And that is, what do leaders need to do to be effective? And this has led to a lot of really great answers. And I might even say too many answers. Right? There's a lot of things. We could probably come up with a list of 100 things or more that we need to do to be an effective leader. But my light bulb moment was, while this is interesting, it feels short-sighted to me. And I'm curious if you feel the same way as I presented this way. I feel like it's short-sighted because, in my mind, leadership isn't about doing better. It's actually about being better. Does that resonate with you? So I think a potentially better question to ask is not what do leaders need to do to be effective, but what do leaders need to be effective? And that's really been the question that's guided me since I did my dissertation. So I spent the last 8 years trying to study this. It's been a great personal development journey as well as a great learning journey for me, and I'm excited to share some of that with you. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the being aspect of leadership. How do we become somebody that others want to follow? And how can we help others to become a better version of themselves so that others will want to follow them? Now, let me do a quick check on a few things here. So I actually want some responses to you. I'm going to make this easy on you. You can give me one finger or two fingers, but here's the question. What do college classes primarily focus on? Would you say doing better or being better? Give me a vote. Hold up a 1 or a 2. All right. I see like 5 2s and everybody else is 1. Right? Now, that's fine. Right? In my mind, most classes focus on here's what you need to know and here's what you need to do. There's nothing wrong with this, right? It's just an acknowledgement that there's not a whole lot of being that gets focused on a college campus. Why do you think that is?
Easier to measure the outcome of a do than a be, because a be is human component, emotion, psychology, whereas when you're doing something, it's easier to observe and measure and quantify.
Right? That makes sense, doesn't it? It's easier to measure doings than it is to measure beings. And we typically focus on what is measured, regardless of whatever it is and whatever context we operate within. What do you think about organizational development? If employees go to a training in an organization, what do you think the focus is on? Give me a vote. 1 or 2? Right? Get a handful of 2s, but I think again, is primarily, not that we don't focus on being, I think we do a little bit, probably not as much as we should, but I think the primary focus is on improving our doings. But if we wanted to improve our ability to operate more effectively, quickly, do a better job of navigating complexity, what do you think would be better to focus on? I'm going to phrase it differently this way. Tooling up or leveling up? What do you think? Give me a vote. 1 or 2. What would be better? Tooling up, which is improving our doings, like we're adding tools into our tool belt, or leveling up? Yeah, so I see a lot of twos. Not that there's anything wrong with tooling up, but it doesn't necessarily improve our ability to operate at a higher level. And what we're getting at here, and what's helpful to understand, is that there's 2 different forms of development. There's what's called horizontal development, and there's also what's called vertical development. How many of you have heard of vertical development before? Not too many of us, right? And so this is going to be one of the hopefully novel insights that we get here. So let me define these for you. Horizontal development is improving our knowledge, skills, and abilities. The focus here is on doing more. It's kind of like adding an app onto an iPad. When we add an app onto our iPad, that broadens our functionality. That's great, right? That's important. I see some students, college students here in the room. Right? If a college student takes an accounting class, what they are usually doing is they are downloading the accounting app onto their iPad so that they can now perform accounting functions in the workplace. Right? They could balance a budget sheet or do a profit loss statement. Right? That's great. That broadens that functionality. But does taking an accounting class improve a student's ability to navigate the stress, the rigor, and the complexity of college life? What do you think, college students? No, not at all, right? And so while horizontal development is good in some ways, it's very limited in other ways, right? If we want to improve our ability to navigate the tumultuousness of our world, whatever that might be, horizontal development doesn't help very much. We need a different form of development, and that comes from vertical development. Vertical development is not adding an app onto our iPad. It's actually upgrading our own internal operating system so that we can operate at a higher level. Now, the definition of formal definition of vertical development is a bit of a mouthful, so I'll give you a heads up, but we'll unpack it here. Vertical development is elevating our ability to make meaning of our world in more cognitively and emotionally sophisticated ways. So the focus here isn't on doing more, it's on being better. So to unpack this definition, we're going to pay attention to we're making meaning of things with different levels of cognitive and emotional sophistication. So let me walk you through an example of this. How would you say that most people respond to constructive criticism? They get defensive, right? Does that make sense? Not that everybody does, right? But they get defensive. When we get defensive, what we are effectively doing is we're putting up a shield. Why would we ever put up a shield? To protect ourselves from an attack, right? So there's different ways that we can make meaning of constructive criticism, right? At a low level of vertical development, we could make meaning of constructive criticism as an attack, right? And if we do, then how we're likely to respond to it is to get defensive. That makes complete sense, doesn't it? But is that cognitively and emotionally sophisticated? Probably not, right? The next level up might be, this might be an attack. Therefore, how I respond depends on who delivers it and how they deliver it, right? If it's my boss and they deliver it tactfully, I love it. But if it's my spouse, that may not go over so well, right? Now that feels a little bit more cognitively and emotionally sophisticated, but it still doesn't seem to be at the highest level. To me, the most cognitively and emotionally sophisticated people, they make meaning of constructive criticism as an opportunity to learn and grow, regardless of who delivers it and how they deliver it. They recognize that even if it's my enemy, there may be a kernel of truth in this that I could benefit from. And if so, I want to know about it. Right? So when we see constructive criticism as an opportunity to learn and grow, then we approach it. Right? To me, this feels really cognitively and emotionally sophisticated because we're in this cognitive and emotional state where we are good with being told that we are bad. And it's just not easy to get there. Does this make sense? How we can make meaning at different levels of cognitive and emotional sophistication? Any questions there? Or you want to push back on this at all? Yes?
How would you distinguish it from some of the concepts around emotional intelligence?
I would say that emotional intelligence is a vertical development topic. I think, and we'll get there at the end, but I think that most emotional intelligence trainings and workshops focus on emotional intelligence from a horizontal development perspective. Here's what you need to know, here's what you need to do. For example, like, to just be overly simplistic, is part of an emotional intelligence workshop might be you need to learn how to listen and to validate. And we can even role play how to do that. But the challenge is when an individual gets into a really stressful situation, all of that training is likely to go out the door. And so what we need to do is we need to elevate their operating system so that, because what we do when we vertically develop, we widen our window of tolerance so that we can listen and validate in those stressful moments. Does that make sense? And let me add to this is, let's just throw out, and I saw your hand. What are some of, you think, the most valuable leadership characteristics? Like, just throw some out to me. Empathy. Good. What? Trust. What else? Authenticity. Vision. Transparency. Integrity. Curiosity. These are great. When we look at these characteristics, I'm going to add patience as another one, right? These characteristics are not improved through knowledge and skill development. These are all vertical development topics. Like, and let me add humility, right, as another one. These are all characteristics that they aren't going to come about through gaining more knowledge and more skills. I can't sign up for a class and get a certification on humility, right? But these will only come about through vertical development approaches.
So as you were talking, it was just kind of making me thinking about the kind of factors in leadership potential, and we look at, personality and learning agility and motivation, and some of those are more malleable than others. So like certain aspects of who someone is are not going to change significantly. So I was wondering how that fits in with, your thought of kind of vertical development within, aspects of, I guess, managing maybe parts of personality that aren't going to change overnight, but how you sort of navigate knowing that about yourself.
Yeah.
Is that sort of like the vertical development is insight, understanding yourself?
Yeah, so we'll get into that a little bit more, I think, but let's point out a couple of things. One is there are innate traits about us. These are the things that are harder to change. Then there are learned traits about us. Not to say that they're always easy to change, but they are malleable. Now, one of the things, vertical development is we can vertically develop. This is our current vertical altitude is representative of our stage of development. And our level of vertical altitude impacts the degree to which we successfully utilize our innate traits. So as we vertically develop, we are better able to employ our innate traits. Does that make sense? And I'll give you some more insights into this as we go along. All right, so this is the concept of vertical development, that as we vertically develop, we elevate in our ability to make meaning of our world in more cognitively and emotionally sophisticated ways. So when we understand this perspective that there's two different forms of development, what we can do is we could create a three-dimensional box like this that represents us. How much knowledge do I have? How much skills do I possess? And what is my level of cognitive and emotional sophistication or mental maturity or literally my being? Right? So all of our boxes in this room are going to be different. And what I'm implying is there's nothing wrong with having more knowledge. There's nothing wrong with having more skills. That's always going to benefit us. But the dimension that is the most important for us to focus on, for our effectiveness, our ability to be an effective leader, is this vertical dimension, this being dimension. But it's the dimension that we tend to not emphasize. And so, so that's the whole purpose of what we're talking about here, is how do we elevate on that vertical dimension. Vertical development is not my idea. In fact, the term vertical development was first coined about 10 years ago. So it's a fairly new term, but the concepts behind it go back to the 1960s. So let me walk you, and they come from the field of developmental psychology. And let me walk you through a quick history lesson around developmental psychology. Developmental psychology started as a field of study in the 1880s. How many of you have taken a human development class? My guess, if you take a human development class, the primary focus was on children developmental stages as they go from infancy to adulthood, right? And that's great, but that's been the primary focus of developmental psychology, particularly from the 1880s to the 1960s. In fact, developmental psychologists used to believe that an individual's development stops when they become an adult. But in the 1960s, there was a select few developmental psychologists that started to push against this. And so what we've learned is that as children develop, as they go from infants to adults, they go through a number of different stages. And they do so rather automatically. It's essentially a function of age. And so as we go through 5 or more stages, depending upon kind of the expert that we're relying upon, in about 20 years, that pace of development is pretty quick. Well, what we've learned since the 1960s from researchers who focus on adult development is they started to ask the question, can adults develop? And if so, do they go through different developmental stages? What they found is that yes, adults can develop, and yes, there are different developmental stages. In fact, there's 3 primary stages. But what they also found is that most adults never develop in adulthood. So what we've learned is that as we transition from children to adults, our development is no longer a function of age. It now becomes a function of effort. And the speed by which we develop really depends upon how much effort we put into this. In fact, here's the research, and we'll dive into this further, on what percentage of adults go through these 3 different levels. So we've got all adults. 64% of all adults never go to a developmental stage beyond what they entered adulthood with. 35% get to level 2 and only 1% get to level 3. Now where we're going to go here next is I'm going to describe what these levels are. But when we look at executives, these percentages are quite different. And you'll see why that is as we get into these stages. Now, something to keep in mind is that these levels are not really narrow. There's some width to these, right? So we can develop within that band, but there is specific stepping stones as we level up, if you will. So where we're going to go next is I want to walk you through these different levels. These ideas around these levels are not my ideas. They're really the culmination of all of the people here, and plus more. And each of these individuals has their own vertical development framework. Some of these individuals focus on 9 levels, for example. Others focus on 6. But they all agree that there's 3 base levels, and if somebody's focusing on 9 levels, it's kind of like there's 3 levels within each stage, if you will. I'm just going to try my best to keep this simple. So that's where we're going next, is to dive into these 3 levels. To introduce us to these 3 levels, I want to do a little exercise with you. So I'm going to show you 3 different slides, each with a whole host of different words and phrases. And I want you to think as we go through these slides, does this feel like a great leader? Is that all right? All right, so here's slide A. I'll just let you read these. What do you think? Does this sound like a great leader? Yeah. Here's slide B. What do you think? Sound like a great leader?
Situational.
Situational. I hear no. Maybe it feels a little bit more like a leader. Would you say that than slide A? And here's C. All right, this sounds more like a great leader, right? Like when you think about some of the great leadership figures, people like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King. I might even add in people like I respect Satya Nadella at Microsoft, Alan Mulally when he was at Ford. Right? These are some of the characteristics of these individuals. And so what this is just, and do you get a different feeling with these slides as you read through these? Right? This is the feeling that you get looking. These are the feelings that we get when we work with leaders who are at these different levels. So there's effectively 3 different types of people. The first type of person is what I would call a good soldier. Right? Good soldiers like slide A. These are people who they want to do what's right. They want to play nice, but they also want to avoid conflict. They really like structure. It provides some certainty. They avoid failure. They oftentimes have tunnel vision. They're focused on limiting problems. They don't want to stand out or rock the boat, but they want to do what's good, right? Which isn't bad. It just isn't great for leadership. So our first level here is what I would call good soldiers. Our second level is what I would call progress makers. These are people who want to win. They want to get ahead. They want to compete. They want to look good. They want to be perfect. They're focused on results. Like for example, I'm working with an executive team, and I asked the COO, Chief Operating Officer. I said, "How do you measure success in your business?" And she said, "Double-digit growth year over year." I'd say a pretty standard answer, right? But it speaks to this level. Right? So the second level is, like I said, progress makers. But then what I would call this third level is value creators. Right? These are the people who are mindful, balanced, centered. They embrace complexity. They're focused on the long term, not the short term. They're willing to let go of what's worked in the past and embrace what's going to work in the future. They are willing to explore new worlds. They're willing to engage in courageous vulnerability. Right? These are the types of people that we see as being better leaders, what I term value creators. Does that make sense to you? I'm not saying those are perfect labels, but I think that they're helpful. So these are the 3 altitudes of vertical development. We're going to dive into each of these. I use these labels. I also use the labels of Mind 1.0, Mind 2.0, and Mind 3.0. Because what I've learned about these levels, and this is what we're going to step into, is that at each level, our body's internal operating system is programmed to fulfill different needs. And as we upgrade our operating system, our needs change. So I'm going to describe that to you. And again, here's the percentage breakdowns of these different individuals. All right, should we get into the levels? All right, so let's start with Mind 1.0, good soldier mode. When somebody's in this mode, their internal operating system is programmed to fulfill their needs of safety, comfort, and belonging. Right? Nothing wrong with having these needs. When we have these needs, or really any needs, there's always going to be a threat to our needs. We could kind of categorize these threats as fears. So when we're in Mind 1.0, our fears are being exposed, being uncomfortable, and not fitting in. So when we are in Mind 1.0, and whether or not we're here now or not, we have all been here. Right? So we should all be able to resonate with this. When we're in Mind 1.0, we want to join and identify with groups or tribes that will fulfill our needs and quell our fears. And that could be a friend group, that could be a family, that could be a social group, it could be an organization where I work, it could be a religious group. And when we enter into these groups, we don't come in saying, I want to take charge here. What we usually say is, I don't want to take charge here. But if you tell me what to do, I will go and do it, and I'll happily do it, provided you keep me safe, comfortable, and feeling like I belong. All right? I was talking to Ryan before this, and he asked me, what got you into academia? And I said, Mind 1.0. Right? I got into academia for safety, comfort, and belonging. In fact, that's built into the structure of being a tenured professor. Right? So that was part of my drive at the time that got me there. When we operate at this level, we give up our power and independence, right? We're saying, I don't want to take charge. I'll let you take charge. You just tell me what to do. When we're operating in this capacity, we become a dependent thinker. You tell me what to do, and I will go and do it. Whenever I talk about this, here's the image that comes to mind, is a huddle of penguins in Antarctica. Right? And when we're in Mind 1.0, our body is wired to get to the center of the huddle. Because that's where we're the most safe, that's where the most comfortable, that's where we feel like we belong. Right? So I'm sure most of us have been to a concert. This is us we're just wired to jockey for position right into the center of this huddle. We want to fit in as much as possible. And in fact, our greatest fear is to be like this sad little penguin. Right? Because it's unsafe, is exposed to predators, it's uncomfortable, it's much colder here than in the center of the huddle, and then they don't feel like they belong. They're ostracized, right? That's the biggest fear of a Mind 1.0 penguin. Does that make sense to you? Now what you're going to see as we move into Mind 2.0, to the progress maker level, is that the notion of standing in the middle of the huddle is like nails on a chalkboard to somebody who's in Mind 2.0. Right? That's part of the shift that occurs as we move from Mind 1.0 to Mind 2.0. So my Mind 2.0, again, our internal operating system changes in that we become focused on different needs. The needs here are to stand out, advance, and be seen of value. In fact, we are willing to be unsafe, uncomfortable, and not belong in order to stand out, advance, and get ahead. Does that make sense? So for me, just in terms of my own vertical development journey, I grew up, my parents were maybe the most frugal people I ever met. Right? My dad actually was a failed entrepreneur. His business went out of business during the economic downturn of the early 80s. And I grew up with my dad essentially saying, You never want to be an entrepreneur because it puts your family at risk, and you never want to go into debt. Right? That was kind of how I was raised. And that was safe. You sense the safe, comfort, belonging kind of in that. Right? And hence, I go into academia to become a professor, seek that out. But then I got to a point where I had some experiences in my life. In fact, I got fired from a job, was really what precipitated it. And then I decided I wanted to write a book. Well, to write a book, I also learned that it's probably, if I ever want to make money from a book, you don't make it from selling books, you make it from doing consulting. So I wanted to start a business. And in order to do that, I needed to go into debt. So I did the very two things that I would have never done previously, which is a symbol that I had elevated to a certain degree. I was now wanting to stand out, advance, and get ahead. And now in some ways, I'm acclaimed for it. I hit the Wall Street Journal bestseller list, right? Through my attempts to stand out, advance, and get ahead. So when we're here, we also have fears, but our fears, of course, have changed. We want to be obsolete, or we fear being obsolete or redundant. We fear failing, falling short, and losing. And we fear not being seen of value. Now, as we shift from mind 1.0 to mind 2.0, we go from being a dependent thinker to being an independent thinker. In fact, we are getting to the point where we have established our own ideas. We're willing to push back against our tribe's beliefs. And because we have our own ideas, we want to run with these ideas. We want to put them to the test. And oftentimes the way that we want to do this is we want to be a leader. I now want to lead out. I want to implement these ideas. And we also recognize that there's a whole host of Mind 1.0 people who we can employ to help us stand out, advance, and get ahead. Right? They're willing to give of their independence, and we could take that and we could get them to work for us, to help us, provided we keep them safe, comfortable, and like they belong. This is why we see 85% of executives operate in Mind 2.0. And so when we're in Mind 2.0, we don't want to be in the center of the huddle. In fact, that's really uncomfortable for us. Where we want to be is we want to be like these penguins here. We kind of want to be up on a hill where we're recognized by everybody else, but we're also in a position to direct those below us, is where we want to operate. That's Mind 2.0. Does that make sense? All right. So now let's jump into Mind 3.0, a place apparently only 1% of people get to. And as we step into this, I imagine that you're now starting to ask yourself a question that most people never ask and never try to answer. And that question is, what is my vertical altitude? Right? It's a really powerful question. Partly because very few people ever ask it. So it's really powerful just for the sake we're asking it. But I'm going to suggest it's not the most powerful question we can ask. There's even a better one. We'll step into it here in just a little bit. Because as you're probably feeling into this, it's not, I'm kind of presenting it almost white and black, and it isn't so white and black. So we'll dive into the nuances here in just a little bit. But let's jump into Mind 3.0. So again, our needs are going to change. At Mind 3.0, our needs are to be of value, to contribute, and to elevate others. Right? At Mind 1.0, we want to stand in. At Mind 2.0, we want to stand out. Usually in the short term, like right now or in the near future. Mind 3.0 people don't care about standing in, and they don't care about standing out. They only care about creating value for others. And of course, we're still going to have fears here. I think these fears are healthy fears. We fear not being of value. We fear taking from or not lifting. And we fear limiting or stifling others. Now, when we're here, we've now made a shift from dependent thinker to independent thinker to now an interdependent thinker. We could hold multiple and complex perspectives simultaneously. I don't know. I feel like whenever you bring up politics, like you bring up controversy, which I hate politics, but I think it's an easy way to make this point, is I think it's really difficult to find a Mind 3.0 person that is polarized on any topic. Right? What we're seeing with politics, and it's well documented, is that there's increasing polarization. I think very rarely would we find a Mind 3.0 person that is polarized on one side or the other. The reason why is because they love the messiness of the middle. That you could take any topic, right? Gun control, abortion, etc. And they recognize that there's more than one position. They want to understand these different positions, and they want to understand the pros and cons associated with these positions. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't take a stand. It just means that usually they want to wrestle with the messiness in the middle before taking a stand. And usually then when they take a stand is rarely on the polar edges. Does that make sense? They're also purpose and long-term focused, right? As I mentioned, in Mind 1.0, we want to stand in right now, right? It's kind of like if we go to a party, it's like, oh my goodness, are people going to accept me? At Mind 2.0, we want to stand out right now. Maybe I want to be the life of the party, or I want to hit the next goals, right? You take, for example, a leader like Jack Welch, like is celebrated when he was the CEO. I think hindsight is always 20/20. But I don't think you would ever find a Mind 3.0 leader that would write a book titled Winning. Right? But he's somebody who is great at hitting shareholder expectations year over year. That seemed to be the focus, the short term, which led GE to be effectively a shell of what it used to be, because they made decisions that maximized shareholder expectations in the short term and negatively affected them in the long term. And they also see and value the systems that go into outcomes. It's not uncommon for me to present to a group of leaders or business owners, and for me to talk about how they need to value culture. It's also not uncommon for me to get pushback in these workshops with some leaders and managers saying, why would I ever want to focus on culture when I could focus on advertising, marketing, and sales? Right? Immediately they're suggesting, okay, they might be Mind 2.0, they're focused on the short-term results, because culture is never a short-term play. It is always a long-term play. And it may be the most important long-term play that a CEO or a leader can play. An example of this is Satya Nadella at Microsoft. He stepped in as CEO and he says the C in CEO stands for curator of culture. That's the most important thing that I can do as a CEO, is curate our culture. And he's now transformed Microsoft. Because they know that culture is a leading indicator that affects the lagging indicators. Mind 2.0 people, they tend to focus on the lagging indicators. Mind 3.0 people focus on the leading indicators. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to stretch our penguin analogy. I'm going to ask for your forgiveness. In fact, I asked, my wife saw me she saw the picture I'm about to show you, and she's like, do you really show this to business leaders? It's like, yes. So here's our Mind 3.0 penguin, which is just, Mind 3.0 people, of course, are very cute. But I was asking myself, what does a Mind 3.0 penguin look like? What would that look like? What I've learned from watching Planet Earth is that emperor penguins in Antarctica, in fact, my son even learned this. He told me this. I thought it was 2 months, but apparently it's 3 months. Emperor penguins, male emperor penguins, incubate their eggs for 3 months, 30 to 50 miles away from their food source. They lose half of their body weight during this time. I think a Mind 3.0 penguin recognizes there's a need here for food. And what if they could bring a food source to these penguins? That would create a huge amount of value. And so they want to bring this food source to these penguins, not to stand in, and also not to stand out, but simply because it's an opportunity to create value for others. And that's what they're the most concerned about. That's a Mind 3.0 penguin. So these are the 3 mind levels here. Does this make sense? Any questions? Yeah.
So you were saying Jack Welch was Mind 2.0.
We're going to get into some nuances here, but I would say predominantly.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Good question. So I've been fortunate to get to know Alan Mulally. Alan Mulally, former CEO at Ford, has really latched on to this model and concepts. And one of the reasons why is, and this is the way that he articulated it. He said he recognizes 85% of executives operate in Mind 2.0. Who generally makes up a board of directors? Former CEOs, right? Who are likely Mind 2.0. And then what's the number one job of a board of directors? To select the CEO. So if we have a board of directors who are all Mind 2.0, who are they most likely to hire into a CEO role? Somebody like them, who also operates at Mind 2.0, really focused on outcomes and results, or somebody who's more Mind 3.0? Probably Mind 2.0. So the question relates to your question of, does the Mind 3.0 focus lead to the results that the Mind 2.0 people really want? And I would say, I can't say yes every time, but I think we have valuable anecdotes that would confirm that. So I think a great example, and if any of you are looking for a book to read, of that board CEO dynamic is Right of a Lifetime by Bob Iger, who I consider Bob Iger to be largely a Mind 3.0 leader. And the board of directors at Disney did not want to hire him, I think because he wasn't Mind 2.0. And then he comes in as CEO and then, of course, radically transforms Disney. I think you look at success of Satya Nadella as a great case study of somebody who I think, well, part of this is we got to consider timeline, right? I would venture to say a Mind 2.0 person is most likely to be successful in the short term, even more successful than a Mind 3.0 person. But a Mind 3.0 person is going to be more successful in the long run. And if given the room to do that, then they generally are. So Satya Nadella's example, Alan Mulally at Ford is, I think, a great example. Mary Barra at PepsiCo, I think, is an example. Indra Nooyi at PepsiCo, Mary Barra at GM. Ed Catmull, when he was at Pixar and then took over as president of Disney Animation as well, turned around Disney Animation. Whenever you see a transformational turnaround that stays or sticks, I think what you'll find is a Mind 3.0 leader. So I think I saw a hand back here first.
So these are really profound and an interesting way to think about leadership, and so I appreciate that. I'm trying to wrestle with some other concepts and how they kind of fit into this kind of model. And so I think of goal orientation. Are you familiar with growth orientation and achievement orientation? And so, and maybe I just don't understand these concepts and you can differentiate for me, but it sounds like the Mind 2.0 is somewhat of an achievement orientation, and Mind 3.0 is somewhat of what Carol Dweck would call growth orientation. And in achievement orientation, it's not interdependent from the idea that you could still be achievement oriented and still be emotionally intelligent and mindful and lead with that. And people that have that orientation in a lot of different contexts and situations have shown replication over and over again to be more successful in performance and more meaning for their employees, satisfaction and whatnot. And so can you help me understand kind of how this would differentiate from that goal orientation concept?
You're stealing my thunder. No, in a good way. No, it's really good. Because what you're identifying is goal orientation is evidence of operating at different levels of cognitive and emotional sophistication, right? So let me play out goal orientation, and I think we'll all make sense of this. Somebody who has a performance avoid goal orientation, if I'm a student in class, is I just don't want to fail the class, right? That's how they make meaning of the class. A performance approach is I want to get the best grade in the class, right? That's how they make meaning of the class. And a learning goal orientation is I don't care about not failing or getting the best grade. I care about learning and mastering the material. And that's how they make meaning. And of course, if they learn and master the material, of course they're usually going to get the best grade in the class. But those are different ways of making meaning at different levels of cognitive and emotional sophistication. So as one, and we'll get into this, as one changes their goal orientation, that is evidence of vertical development occurring. Does that make sense?
And so, to that point, you would say achievement orientation is a lower level up below a goal orientation.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Following up with your analysis of Bob Iger and let's talk a little bit about how institutions themselves are like 1, 2s, and 3s. For example, I was just thinking about we just selected a new president here at the University of Oklahoma. And so the board may have had in mind previously to what the president we had before may have had a number in mind, 1, 2, or 3. But organizations, it seems to me, for example, Disney just got Iger back. He obviously was a 3, but they're in a firefight right now. So they may have decided for some other reason why they wanted him, because they thought he had a little bit of 3, but maybe a 2.5 is a good number. And I was just thinking if you could talk a little bit about how institutions themselves, they have numbers and they have a sense of what they think. And then they sort of sometimes will say, that person is going to be just about the right number we need now. Right? So they're kind of, you have the individual and you have the organization. And so maybe you could finish your ideas.
Well, I feel like you're more optimistic than I am, which probably says a lot about you and a lot about me at the same time. Part of me is, I don't think very many selection committees of high-level leaders even think in the terms of what is their vertical altitude. And so I'm not sure they're as strategic as what you suggest. I think you look at Disney, I think Bob Chapek is a very clearly Mind 2.0 leader. And they're like, this is not working, so we need to go back to something. A valid point is that Bob Iger was great during acquisition mode. Can he be great in execution mode? That's a question that I have around that leadership. But to your point is, here's some of the laws of vertical development for leaders. The vertical altitude of the executive team sets the ceiling for the organization. Because the executive team's vertical altitude dictates the policies, practices, and strategies that they implement. For example, at Microsoft, Steve Ballmer institutes a stacked rank performance management system. That makes sense for a Mind 2.0 leader because I want to identify the people who stand out. That was the first thing that Satya Nadella takes out. Right? This is not going to work. It's not helpful to our culture. It creates competition as opposed to collaboration. So the vertical altitude of the executive team determines the policies that they make. If we want to elevate an organization, the best way to do that is by elevating the vertical altitude of the executive team. And it really is, I think, the only way to elevate an organization. We can look at different organizations and I think we can identify what altitude they seem to be operating at collectively. My experience working at higher level institutions, and I come from one that may be a really large bureaucracy within maybe the largest bureaucracy in the country, the Cal State school system, is it's very much a Mind 1.0 atmosphere. It's how do we stay safe? In fact, I think my institution is more concerned about ensuring that we don't have problems than they are concerned about student success.
And I'm sorry, maybe I was a little Mind 2.0 there, and I want to get Mind 3.0. I actually brought my entire talent management skills course here today. That's a lot of my students here. And so to make sure I'm adding value to them and everybody else in the classroom, I thought I'd practice a little 3.0. And so we're actually covering selection right now, and this week and last week. And one of the things I asked them to think about was, how can you identify people in these different stages for selection purposes? And so do you have some thoughts right now as we're kind of talking about it on, you've talked a lot about what somebody with Mind 3.0 is doing, but how would you in a selection process identify it?
Yeah, well, I think that there's indicators that we can identify, and I'll get into more specific ones. Like, for example, I could ask a group of leaders, how do you measure success? And I will have, one person who says double-digit growth year over year. And the thing that really irks me about that answer from that CEO is this is an organization, or the COO, this is an organization who operates in the medical documentation space. Right? If you go to a doctor's office, you have used their products in terms of filling out paperwork. They touch over 1 billion customers a year. They are in a position to change the medical environment. And she tells me double-digit growth year over year. Right? Somebody who's Mind 3.0 is going to talk much more about the purpose of the organization than they are about the double-digit growth. So that may be an indicator there as an example. But the challenge with selection around this is that generally we want to select around things that don't change because it's a better predictor of future performance than things that do change. And vertical development is something that changes, right? What they come in with hopefully isn't the thing that they end with. But I'll get into some more specifics here. So, yeah. Okay. So these are the 3 levels. I'm going to bring up a line here. When we operate below this line, where is our focus?
On ourselves.
Us. I want to stand in or I want to stand out. It's only when we get above that line that's now bigger than us. We want to contribute to something bigger than us. So what this framework does, as I mentioned, it immediately gets us to ask the question, what is my vertical altitude? Which, again, is a really powerful question. But let me ask a question that I think exposes the flaw in this, is how many of you see all 3 mind levels in yourself? Right? So that's the inherent flaw, is I see all 3 mind levels in myself. So another question to ask that I think is even more powerful is not what is my vertical altitude, but what is my center of gravity? What percentage of my time am I spending at each of these different mind levels? And of course, there's nothing to these numbers other than I was just breaking down how it can be different. And this gets us to then ask the question, how do I spend a greater amount of time in Mind 3.0? So I might even invite you to ask yourself, what do you do on a daily basis to get in and stay in Mind 3.0? Do you even do something? Right? Because getting there doesn't occur by chance. It only occurs through intentionality. So what I presented here, which I'm hopefully thinking are likely new concepts. Talked about now vertical versus horizontal development, 3 different mind levels, and center of gravity. Here. Does this feel new, novel to you? I've created a space to ask questions, so we can do some more questions, but let me even ask you a question. What are the implications of understanding this? It changes how we think about our own personal growth. It should also change how we think about helping others to grow. Good. What else? What are other implications?
Intentionality.
Good.
Makes you aware of the need in the beginning.
Yeah. And to me, that's been personally, it's been one of the most powerful things about understanding this framework, is because without these labels, level 1, level 2, level 3, I'm never even going to focus on this. But once I put labels to it, now I have the possibility of focusing on it. Good. What other implications?
Well, there's something to be said about just, I'll call it, growth through your time period in whatever. So as you become a leader, you can set more stages. So there's that idea that you said it yourself a few minutes ago. If your culture and your organization is operating at a different level and you're an entry-level person, I mean, made to fit when there might be a bad fit, because you want to operate at a level, but you're in an organizational context that's functioning on results, and you're trying to function. So I'm curious your reaction to the fact that your ability to function at that higher level may become more evident as you rise up to the top, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's and that's one of the biggest challenges, is right when I work with a leadership team, they're usually reporting to some sort of stakeholders who want results, right? And that becomes, they're now socially, why do we focus on results? It's the same reason why we focus on skills in college classes. They are easy to measure.
Also, Wall Street measures them and they get fired. So, it's back to the fear factor, as you said earlier.
And it's challenging because you look at, unfortunately, most athletic coaches aren't given much room to work with, right? You see a new coach gets fired every day. The Atlantic Hawks just fired their coach, and 2 years ago he was like on the running for Coach of the Year. It's like, how does this happen? But then you look at other coaches like Greg Popovich with the San Antonio Spurs, Bill Belichick with the New England Patriots, Phil Jackson with the Bulls and the Lakers. These are individuals that they don't seem to be focused on results and winning. They focus on things like relationships, individualization, the leading indicators that lead to the lagging indicators that they want. Of course, I think that there's some really vertically developed coaches that don't get the lead time to be able to execute, but some do. Yeah.
I don't know if it's an implication, but the image or the cartoon that you had of Mind 3.0 is also related to what you said earlier about a 5-year old. And the qualities that a 5 or even lesser, 3 to 5-year-old has are the qualities that we seem to espouse in the Mind 3.0. Right? So it's almost begs the question. Here is somebody, we all, when we were 3 to 5 years old, were in Mind 3.0. Then we degenerate or devolve into 1.0, and then we come to classes like this to learn how to go back. My point being that while this is necessary, the train has already left the station and we're trying to kind of rein it in. But there is a big need for whatever we are talking about to be transmitted at younger levels, students, not just college students, but even schools, etc., which is what we discussed, so that, we are all the result. We are all, right now what we are doing is we are facing the result of, I'm going to call it an economy of achievement. So the standard, the yardsticks are all about achievement, which is external. There is not one discussion about internal yardsticks, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I go on to say a little bit, I don't know if there's anybody from India here. Anybody from India? No, so I can fit. So we have, and you talked about Satya Nadella and Nui, we have a word called sanskar, which is culture. This is a colloquial interpretation of the word culture. But culture is built on generations of understanding. It's not just one conversation. Culture cannot be changed in an organization by one person. It has to be continued over a generation by groups of people of the same mindset. So in the same way, Satya Nadella and Indra Nui have been recipients of a culture that they brought with them and then they applied to the environment that they were. So I'm submitting that is an example of somebody or culture having been inculcated and then the actual application done.
Yeah. One of the things I love about what you said is that, as you talk about, it seems like children have some of those Mind 3.0 characteristics. And not that they're vertically developed, those, but I think the theme there is, what do 3 and 5-year-olds not have that we gain over time, that we try to lose? And that's fear. Right? 3 to 5-year-olds, they don't have fear, right? The fear of looking bad, for example, might be something that we pick up. So we'll dive into that more deeply, but I appreciate that. So let me, go ahead. Yes.
So we trained leaders before the pandemic. We trained leaders during the pandemic virtually, and we're training leaders after the pandemic. Our team's sitting over there. I think what we observed, and I needed this really badly sooner, but I think what we observed is a backsliding during the traumas of the pandemic. And so my question is, as you look at this, what tools might we access to help protect people from backsliding? Or what happens in the context of leadership that we might help with that?
Yeah, so when I just talked about fear, what's the opposite of fear? Safety, right? So when we don't feel safe, we will naturally pull down in terms of our vertical altitude. And so part of what we need to provide is safety. And in fact, that's one of the, when you look at Satya Nadella, Ed Catmull, Alan Mulally, one of their biggest emphasis was creating safety so that people now don't focus on themselves and they have the ability to focus on something bigger than themselves. The other element that's going on with the COVID pandemic that brings this about, I think it's really important to understand, is what we saw with the COVID pandemic, and we're going to continue to see it, is rapidly rising complexity. And then what we've got to ask ourselves, has the development of our leaders kept pace with that rising complexity? And I don't think so. And what's happened is this now leaves what I would call a leadership deficit. And when we operate in a deficit, we don't feel safe. Now, if I were to go to business executives and ask them, do you operate in a leadership deficit? I don't think anybody would say no. I'm not operating at that level. But what we are seeing now, how does this feel? What does this look like? What are the consequences of this? Is deterioration of leaders' mental health is the first domino to fall. And what we're finding now is 73% of executives over the last year have been suffering with some issue related to mental health. Sleeping disorders as being the primary issue. Depression of leaders and managers in organizations now is at the level or exceeds the level of the average adult. And what we find is that compared to pre-pandemic, so pre-pandemic, 1% of leaders admitted to thinking about self-harm. It's now 7%. So those are the evidences of operating at a leadership deficit. So that's the other element to consider there. So which makes our job as leadership developers so much more important. So we've got to close that gap. And vertical development, I think, I'm biased, is the best way to do that. So let's talk a little bit about how we go about doing this. So we could spend all day talking about this, but I'll try to simplify this for us. How do we go about doing this? Well, we need to go back to our definition of vertical development, and there's a key here. Right? The key is making meaning. We need to help other people improve how they make meaning of their world. What causes people to see the same thing but potentially interpret it differently? Right? Constructive criticism as an attack versus an opportunity to learn and grow. What causes this? Well, that's our mindsets. The mental lenses that we wear that shape how we view the world around us. And what we found around mindsets is both psychologists and neurologists have identified mindsets as the most foundational mechanism for everything that we do. Because how we see our world shapes how we think, learn, and behave, and therefore our success in our life, our work, and our leadership. For example, if I see constructive criticism as an attack, I will think about it negatively, I won't learn from it, and I will get defensive. If I think about constructive criticism as an opportunity to learn and grow, I'll think about it positively, I will learn from it, and I will approach it, right? Which will lead to completely different outcomes. So in my research, what I found is there's more than 4 sets of mindsets, but in terms of academic research, there's 4 sets of mindsets that have received over 40 years of research attention, and they all range on a continuum from negative to positive. I don't love those terms, but it's easier to say than less cognitively and emotionally sophisticated and more cognitively and emotionally sophisticated. So these are the 4 mindset sets. And I'm just going to introduce these to you really quickly on the next slide. But what the idea is that I have a mindset assessment. If you want to go to my website and take it, that's fine. I've had 30,000 people take my mindset assessment. Only 2.5% are in the top quartile for all 4 sets of mindsets. Most of us, myself included, have some mindset work to do. And that just speaks to we're just not all vertically developed, and that's okay. But to introduce these mindsets to you, I'm going to ask you a question. So I'm going to present 4 different desires. I want you to tell me whether or not society says these are good or bad desires. Is that all right? All right, here's the desires. A desire to look good, a desire to be right, a desire to avoid problems, and a desire to get ahead. What do you think? Society says these are good or bad? Says they're good, right? Because who likes to look bad, be wrong, have problems, and get passed up? Nobody, right? These are very justifiable desires. But when we have these desires, where's our focus? Ourselves. These are the desires that are fueled by the negative mindsets, the less sophisticated mindsets, fixed, closed, prevention, inward. And when we have these mindsets, we operate in more good soldier mode, right? Mind 1.0 is kind of over here on the left. And when I first learned about these mindsets, I found that these were the mindsets I had. And part of the story that I tell myself, I may tell the second part of the story, but part of the story I told myself was I just didn't know that there was better desires to have. Such as a desire to learn and grow, a desire to find truth and think optimally, a desire to reach goals, and a desire to lift others, which are fueled by the more positive mindset. So when we have these, we operate more as a value creator. But this is not easy, because if I want to learn and grow, I need to be okay with looking bad at times. If I want to find truth and think optimally, I've got to be okay being wrong or admitting I've been wrong at times. If I want to reach goals, I've got to wade through problems at times. And if I want to lift others, I've got to put myself on the back burner at times. And I don't know about you, but it's just not easy to do those things at times or in the moment. But as we shift our mindsets, then we vertically develop and we become a more effective leader. So what I'm suggesting to you is that one of the best ways, it's not the only way, but one of the best ways to vertically develop is to awaken, to investigate, and focus on improving our mindsets. Because what we're literally changing is our meaning makers, these mental lenses that shape how we make meaning of our world. So when I work with organizations, I'll have them take my mindset assessment. I'll usually aggregate their mindsets up to a collective level, and it will produce results like this. So this is a group of about, I think, 30 leaders, highest level leaders in an organization. And we can get a sense of where they're at as an organization. So this is a group that almost half of them are in the bottom quartile of my database. Really strong fixed mindsets. They're really focused on looking good. They're moderately open, but not very open. They're really they're kind of moderately promotion minded. There's almost half of them are more focused on avoiding problems than on reaching goals or fulfilling a purpose. And very few people are in the top quartile for having an outward mindset. So from looking at these results, we can get a pretty clear picture. These are the leaders in the organization, and usually where do we find the best mindsets at the top. It usually becomes more negative the further we go down. So what does this say about our organization is we have a lot of fear around looking bad. We're not too open. Half of us are focused on avoiding problems as opposed to reaching goals. And we are focused on me getting ahead as opposed to how do I create value for others. So it just suggests this isn't a very vertically developed group. I'm going to kind of summarize this, but I do want to give some insights into some of my latest learnings here. But what we've talked about here is what I'm suggesting is to truly be effective at developing ourselves and other leaders, we need to focus on our beings as opposed to doings. And really the best way to do, we don't do that, but the best way to do that is to focus on vertical development. And just by learning about vertical development, learning about these different mind levels, learning about mindsets, which are one way that we can improve our vertical altitude, we now become empowered for ourselves or to others in helping us to elevate. Does that make sense? We got maybe a couple minutes for questions here, and then I just want to close this with an idea here. But any questions on this?
I want to comment that it's excellent that you and your colleagues are working to make a shift in leaders. And if I might digress for a moment, as our culture has changed drastically, in the 1940s and 50s, over 80% of the population worshiped in their churches. And I don't mean the mega conservative churches. I mean, over 2 examples. The man who built Sears was a Jewish man who put guarantees in the products, served the customers, but even more than that, he built in ownership to the employees so they would be vested. And I'm old enough that I knew people who worked in that, and they loved it, they loved him, and they loved the company, and it was huge. Now it's not. But he was Jewish, his faith called him to do that. Another person, Aaron Fernstein, his company, Malden Mills in New England, burned in the 90s. He took his own money and paid his employees. He would have been better off taking the insurance and retiring. He was older. But he used his own money and paid his employees while he rebuilt with the insurance money. And he said he did that because his faith required him to do it because it was community culture, as the gentleman to the right told me. So I think what you and others are doing, you're bringing that sense of ethic in a non-religious way, which is great because I don't care how it is. It's just that the ethic of respect. And Sloan, who built GM, once said, take my buildings, take everything, just give me my people.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you feeling that way. It gives us, right? So here's one of the challenges. As a leader of an organization, and part of this comes from my discussion with Alan Mullally, is you even look at some of his leaders under him. Like Mark Fields was the one who succeeded him as a CEO, and he flopped kind of as a CEO. And both Alan and my study of Mark would say he was more of a Mind 2.0 leader. But what Alan Mullally was able to do with Ford was turn around Ford with the same leaders that was there that led them to a position where they were losing $12.7 billion a year. Right? So he took the same leaders. Well, how did he make the change with those same leaders? I don't think he got everybody to go from maybe a Mind 1.0 or Mind 2.0 to a Mind 3.0. Not everybody that happened. But what he was able to do as a Mind 3.0 leader is to create a culture that did foster safety, that allowed individuals, including Mark Fields, to take their eyes off of themselves and to focus on a bigger purpose. And so in these examples that you bring up, there's a bigger purpose that they're attached to. And it's a purpose that is connected to creating value. So in my study of the most vertically developed leaders, I think that's the number one priority of vertically developed leaders, is a clear, inspirational, and stakeholder-centric purpose. Yeah.
Do you have any podcasts or books you recommend?
Lots of books. I don't listen to as many podcasts. Let me give you some book recommendations. And we've talked about some of these leaders. So, for example, Alan Mulally at Ford, American Icon is a great book. Creativity, Inc., that's Ed Catmull at Disney and Pixar. Mentioned Bob Iger's book. No Rules Rules by Reid Hoffman and Aaron Meyer about Netflix is a really good one. That's a Think Again by Adam Grant is a really good one. There's a bunch more, but that's a handful. Does that work for now?
Yeah, that's great. Thank
Okay. No book clubs in your future, is there? All right, so let me end with some insights on what I think is the most meaningful aspect about talking about vertical development. We brought up the notion of emotional intelligence. What would you say most emotional intelligence development efforts focus on? Improving knowledge and skills or improving neurological wiring? Usually we focus on knowledge and skills. What is it and how do you do it, right? Very little focuses on neurological wiring. What is emotional intelligence? It's about our ability to connect with our own emotions and manage and navigate those, as well as connect with the emotions of others and manage and navigate those in an effective way, right? The secret of emotional intelligence, there's kind of two aspects about this, is our ability to recognize and effectively navigate our own emotions as well as those of others is predicated upon how effectively our brain functions. Let me explain this. And this is the second part of the secret of emotional intelligence. At least 70% of adults have experienced something that has negatively impacted their ability to be emotionally intelligent. And that something is psychological trauma. So research is finding at least 70% of adults, and what's psychological trauma is defined in a couple different ways. One way is it's experiences resulting from feelings of intense fear, helplessness, and horror. What I'm learning is that trauma, psychological trauma, is not about what we experience, but our body's effects to what we experience. Let me explain this here. So there's 3 brain networks that go in our mind that relate to how we pick up and interpret information, how we make meaning of our world. The 3 networks are our default mode network. This is a network that's primarily housed in our prefrontal cortex that's responsible for our automatic non-conscious processing. That's effectively where our mindsets live. There's the salience network. This is largely our limbic system that's in charge of our emotions. And then there's the our central executive network, which is responsible for our cognitive thought. Okay? So in an ideal and healthy mind, these 3 networks work really well together. But what we find is that when somebody experiences psychological trauma, our brain's nervous system adapts and changes how these networks work together. It adapts in a manner that is designed to protect us from future trauma, right? Which is good in some sense, but if our brain is adapted to ensuring that we don't experience future trauma, but we don't actually live out that trauma, then we may be overcompensating for something effectively. So there's 2 adaptations. The first adaptation is the salience network, the emotional network, becomes oversensitive and overactive. And the default mode network struggles to regulate that. When this happens, we become hypervigilant. What's going on here is our window of tolerance gets narrow. We get more prone to fall outside of our window of tolerance. We're more prone to be anxious, right? I ask my college students to raise their hand if they feel like they struggle with anxiety. I get 3/4 of my students that raise their hands, right? This is evidence of past trauma, which at Cal State Fullerton, we serve a population that has largely been traumatized and that they struggle with anxiety. So this is one of the adaptations. The other adaptation is that our default mode network becomes stronger and overregulates our salience network. This is what we call dissociation. Dissociation is our inability to connect with our own emotions. So I do an exercise with CEOs and executives, and we get to a point in the exercise where I'll ask them, and it naturally comes up, what fear is going on here for you? And they sit up straight, probably about 1 in 5, 1 in 6, they'll sit up straight and they'll say, I don't have fears. I'm not driven by fear, right? And as I always kind of scratch my head is, do you not have fear, or do you have an inability to connect with your fears? Because I think we all have fears, only some people have a reduced capacity to connect with those fears, right? And that would be evidence of dissociation. So at least 70% of adults have experienced mind-altering trauma, which has led to some form of hypervigilance or dissociation. In terms of hypervigilance, we struggle to regulate our own emotions. That's an important part of emotional intelligence. And we struggle, because we don't regulate our own emotions, we're more concerned about our emotions than the emotions of others. Right? Of course, that's going to hinder our emotional intelligence. With dissociation, we struggle to connect with our own emotions. And if we can't connect with our own emotions, how good of a job do we do at connecting to the emotions of others? I was meeting with an executive team the other day, and one of the ladies on the executive team said, my kids, she said this proudly, my kids never came to me when they skinned their knees. They knew that if they came to me, I would just say, walk it off, rub dirt on it. Like, she was the most bristly person like I've ever met. What do you think her subordinates felt? The exact same way. Here's a bristly leader, right? And it's just evidence of this, what level of emotional intelligence does she have? Understanding this changes everything. Most people have experienced trauma to the degree that it impacts their ability to be emotionally intelligent. Well, how does this change everything? Well, one, it suggests how do we go about improving this situation? Well, we've got to focus on our internal operating system, not the development of knowledge and skills. That requires vertical development. But here's the core message of vertical development from understanding this neurological connection, is that if we want to vertically develop, if we want to improve our being, at a foundational level, we've got to focus on healing our bodies, our minds, and our hearts. In fact, that's the only way to vertically develop, is to focus on healing ourselves. So to me, that's the most beautiful and the most profound message about all of this. It's something that now sharing with you, I hope we can collectively do a better job of focusing on our own healing as well as helping others to heal, so that we operate with less fear and are able to operate at a higher level that's more focused on creating value in the world around us. Thank you.